In the late 1970s, my parents bought the family home in Strathfield in Sydney. An old Federation place, they renovated it, loved it, and lived in it, raised their family for the next 40 odd years. We've just sold that place as my parents have both moved up the coast to retire, so my siblings and I decided a memento was in order. We commissioned a watercolour artist, also from Sydney, to paint a lovely picture of the front of the property. And fortunately, when I was doing some work on the veranda a couple of years ago, I managed to salvage some of the original timbers. They're a bit of a mix, but they would do well to make a frame for the watercolour. This would also be the first project that I'll be making with my lovely new CTS table saw. Believe it or not, in 4+ years of woodworking, I have never made a picture frame, so this is certainly not a how-to. I'm not quite set up for doing things the way that you should do picture frames. There are a million videos to teach you how to do that. This is a project about framing my youth. I lived at the Strathfield place until I basically started travelling in my early 20s after graduating from uni, and it will forever remain the place that shaped me into the person I am today. So here in the garage of Wifey and mine's first home, let's see what we can do about turning these old veranda palings into a family heirloom. So the first thing I did was joint the edges of the boards, and then I had to be very careful. I didn't have much stock to work with, and I needed to cut these into enough material to make the 4 sides. Fortunately, with the new table saw, this didn't prove too challenging. If I look a bit tentative, that's because this is my first project using the thing, and I had a jolly good time learning basically what I can and can't get away with. It wasn't all quite as smooth as what I showed here. I had a couple of little nervous moments, but with the push sticks and the featherboard, I got through these narrow cuts quite successfully. Out of the haul, I reckon I've got some Meranti, some Merbo, and some Silky Oak. There was some pine too, but that didn't have to make the cut. After I had my thin strips sliced, one quick run with the plane over each side, jointed the edge nicely for glue up. .12 pieces to make 4 sides, and of course praying that they don't stick together and you don't put glue on the wrong bits. Couple of cauls to hold them mostly flat, and I left those overnight to dry. They were looking pretty good. But now I had to figure out how I was going to mitre them. I don't have a picture frame sled, I don't have any sleds on the table saw yet. So I figured I'd probably do these on the miter saw. Not the most accurate tool, but I think I can get it to work. Before I could think about that though, I had to take out my planer, being a hand plane, just to smooth out the slight variation in thickness between all the pieces. Once I'm all settled in with the table saw, I reckon a thicknesser might be the next tool on the to buy list. Before chopping the angles, I decided to cut in the rebate. As you saw earlier, I've got an old frame that I picked up for $10 from the local charity shop. It had a nice piece of glass in it and a bit of hardware which I would be able to recycle. But I just didn't like the way that it looked, hence why we're building this one. I tried a quick Roman OG bit, but I really didn't like the profile, so instead I decided to manufacture my own, using that giant cove bit and a small box bit or coring bit. And after a few test runs, this is what I came up with. Yeah, that should do nicely. I'll save you watching the many routes, but needless to say, they were done in several passes, until that came out at the end of it. It wasn't too bad, but I really wanted the transitions between the colours of wood to match the physical transition, so we took out the little block plane and chamfer all the things. Just slicing away enough of the timber until the curves matched with the changes in timber. Hit it with the sandpaper, and that came out quite nicely. I was also able to salvage the hardware off the old frame, and I wanted to keep the wire and also these little points, so I'd be able to use them when I reassembled everything in the new frame. That backing board would also come in handy, as would that white border thing. It was quite nice and clean, and one of the reasons I selected that particular thing from the shop. This frame was actually incredibly well made. I had to cut it very, very carefully in order to get the sides off, and gently get the piece of glass out. In hindsight, I probably should have gone for perspex, but something in me just said I wanted glass, so I tapped on all the ones in the shop until I found one that tinged. That glass would set the size of my frame, and now that I'd measured twice that, I would hopefully only cut once these mitres. But as good as the CTS is, like most table saws, particularly job site saws, the mitre gauge that came with it was completely rubbish. So that confirmed it. I was going over to the mitre saw, and using my Vip and Envisage design bevel gauge, set that at a very accurate 45, transferred that to my blade, and then made sure that I cut each of the opposing mitres on opposite sides of the blade, because then even if I was out by half a degree, then the mating face should be out by the same amount in the opposite direction, and that will hopefully give me fairly tight mitres. Once I'd cut the first pair, I could then mark out exactly how long I needed my pieces to be, and snuck up on them very carefully back at the saw, using some blue tape to help eliminate the chip out. That was a lovely clean result. But because it's my first frame and I don't trust gluing mitre joints, I also needed to figure out reinforcement. With my fancy routed profile on there, I couldn't do external splines, so I decided to do internal splines. Using the slot cutter to make the mortises in the corners of the frames worked very well. And then I picked up another little piece of reclaimed timber, this off my current property. It's a bit of Australian cedar from out of an old window box, which I could then use the hand plane to gently take down until it fits snugly in those mortises that I'd cut. Pulling out the Lark diameter tool, thanks Derek, I could find out what sort of profile the inside of my slot cutter would make, and then use that to mark out some mini biscuits. Like I only had to make 4 of these because they're a bit of a pain in the ass. But I managed to chop them out, got the rasp and filed them down to the correct size. Then it was time for a dry fit. I was really quite pleased with this. However, I did notice that my sort of hand-cut profiles weren't quite matching up, and that's something that I would have to deal with after the glue had gone in. But for now, all I needed to do was trim down those biscuits so that they weren't interfering with the rebate, and this happened really easily with a quick chisel plunge. And then my artisanal splines could be glued on in, tied up with the band clamp, and left overnight to dry. Coming back the next day, and that worked pretty well. I was happy enough anyway for my first attempt at a frame, a few small little gaps, but what are you going to do? I'm sure I'll get better as I make more of these over the years. The good news is, when I gave it a shake, it did not want to fall apart. Those splines worked really, really well. Also, fortunately, one of my mates gave me this beautiful Japanese carving chisel set for my 40th birthday a few months ago, and I could use the different diameters on these in order to try and match up the profiles, and where I had some of the boards that were slightly thicker than the others, I could have a lot of fun just gently easing over the edges and shaving away bit by bit with the different shaped chisels until everything mated up very, very nicely. To help hide those gaps, and before we sanded it down flush, put in the old clear PVA glue, let it soak in for a second, and then working within the same colour of wood, hit it with the sandpaper backwards and forwards so that the sawdust from that colour of wood goes into that colour gap, and that actually worked really well. After that, I could smooth off the entire frame up to about 400 and give myself a blister on my thumb by using it as a sanding block to get into those little grooves. As I hope this would become a hand-me-down family heirloom, I decided to give it the good old sign too. Of course, that could get confused with my brother Jonathan, but he's currently not doing woodwork, so hey, it's going to be me. While I had the Japanese chisels out, I decided, let's give the Dremel the day off. I've been having fun with hand tools on this project. and so I tried for the first time to do some carving with the V-tool bit. It wasn't too hard, and my handwriting looks like I'm 5 anyway, so quite frankly, this was a fantastic result. The bendy corners were a little bit trickier coming across the grain, but we got there eventually. Coloured it in with a texture, hit it with some sandpaper, and then that was ready for finish. Tack cloth off all of the sandy dust, and here's another new addition. So I've been a fan of the Kustom grit by my mate Scotty for a while now, as a few of you have probably realised, but I recently saw him use these pads from Hammeroo. They're slightly different strengths of sponge. There's the yellow one, which I've got the step 1 on here. Turn the sander right down to the slowest speed and use that to work it into the grain, and that was so much better than doing it by hand. And the sort of foamy softness of the pad was great, because even in those profiles I could still use the power sander. I still had to revert to doing it by hand in some of those more tricky corner places. After that was done, you could instantly jump up to the step 2, change to the orange pad, and work it on in. Look at the shine that brings up. It's beautiful stuff, Kustom grit. Make sure you try it out. Not only is it a polish, but Kustom grit is a finish, and apart from putting a little bit of beeswax over the top to make it smell good, that is done. Those buffing pads you can just store in an airtight bag, and they will keep indefinitely. With the finish finished, it was time to put this all together. Very, very gently handling the shatty death glass that will break into 1,000 shards if I get it wrong. I attached the watercolour to its border, and fortunately that border was exactly the right size. Returned the old backing plate. Drilled a few little tiny relief holes, and gently, gently, gently tapped on in the original points. Not the most elegant solution, but it worked. While we're at it, we might as well brand all the things, and then realise that because mine is a landscape and the old one was a portrait, that the old wire would not work, so I had to flip that around 90 degrees. Drill some new holes. Still the old hardware. And then break out a bit of the old picture wire. Now, I'm not going to show you how to tie this knot because I just googled it on the internet and I did a terrible job, which I then hid with some black electrical tape. But at least we were done. I actually ended up timing this really well, and it became the Christmas present that my siblings gave to Mum and Dad for 2022's Christmas celebrations, and they both cried, so mission was accomplished. But before that, I hung it up at home just to see how it would look, and ain't she schmick. Blue Ginger Designs did an absolutely fantastic job realising that photograph into that beautiful watercolour of my family home, and having the frame made from the Meranti silky oak and the Merbo from the back veranda just nearly brings a tear to my eye. I guarantee you this isn't the best frame I'll ever make, but quite honestly, it's probably going to be the most important.